All right. Well, now that we're being recorded, we'll go ahead and get started. We want to make sure we have all the entire use of our time, especially with our time with Eric. Thank you all for being here today with our November Learn at Lunch entitled Ready, Set, Change. Hopefully you know what you signed up for. A lot of us have been dealing with change, so much for the past few years. I feel like some of us might consider us experts in change. But there is a process to change, and leaders play a critical role in determining the success of that effort. So responding to change positively, effectively, and responsibly allows leaders to create successful outcomes by engaging employers and inspiring them to embrace different ways of working or thinking. So while there are different approaches to achieving desired results, having dedicated resources and managing the people side of change greatly contribute to a successful change management process. I know over the past few years, I felt like we have been dragging some of our coworkers kicking and changing into change, and Eric's going to sort of help us do a better job so we're not dragging them and maybe guiding them in a more effective way. But before we get started, as you all know, we can't do programs like this and bring thought leaders like Eric to you without the gracious support of our sponsors, and today is no different. Today we have Tony Lira, Director of Sales with the Texas State Association Group with Hilton Worldwide, and I want to let Tony say a few words before I introduce Eric officially. So Tony, I'll pass the mic over to you.
Hi, thank you everybody, and thank you for joining our Learn at Lunch today. Obviously, I am Director of Sales for the Texas State Association Market, representing Hilton Worldwide Sales. I am actually your one-stop shop, and I just want to thank everybody for having your meetings this year and looking for future business as well. And also, it's great to see everyone in September at our New Ideas Conference. So with that said, I just want to say thank you. If you need to reach me, you can find my contact information at the TSAE membership directory. And I will turn it back over to Stephen to go ahead and introduce Eric Curtis. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, Tony. And what some of you may not know, Tony doesn't just support us as a sponsor, but Tony is also a member of the TSE Board of Directors. So thank you, Tony, not only for your financial support, but for your time and support of moving TSE forward. So we're grateful for you. Thank you for that.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Curtis. So Eric is the CEO of Curtis Strategy, an innovative consulting firm focused on designing breakthrough strategy and innovative business models. He has advised colleges and universities, healthcare and human service agencies, and many professional associations, inspiring them to break the status quo and maximize their strategic impact. Eric received his MBA from Suffolk University and his BS in accounting and finance from Norwich University. So with that, please welcome Eric Curtis to the microphone. There you go, Eric, it's all yours.
All right, Stephen, thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you, Tony and Aaron, for hosting me. I appreciate TSAE's invite. And thank you for sharing your lunch today with me. Hopefully we'll be breaking some bread together and talking a little bit about the process of change and the different types of change. So our consulting firm works a lot with organizations moving from strategic planning into some form of change or dealing with disruptive change like COVID or other major things that are transforming the landscape. And change can happen at multiple different levels, right? It could be something that you want to do with your board of directors in developing the board and having a clear process for that level of change, moving from a strategic plan into implementation, or it could be something really technical or tactical that doesn't require a lot of effort. I think the point is that there's different levels of size and scope. And so as I go through and I talk through some of the different things that we're going to cover today, you may have something in your mind that you want to try to look at and figure out solutions for. So the size and complexity of that really does matter, because it does take a significant amount of time, energy, capacity, and resources to start looking at and implementing change. So I think the first thing I want to do is set a little context for everybody about how complex change can be. And I use this example called the coffee shop experiment, which is a really simple experiment if any of you are crazy enough to actually run it. It starts out by walking into your favorite coffee shop and finding a person that is sitting in that absolutely amazingly comfortable leather chair in the corner, sipping their favorite cup of joe, and go up to them and kindly ask them to move their seat from the nice leather chair over to the very hard wooden chair at the wooden table. It's a simple experiment. You can go up to a total stranger, ask them to move their seat. The first reaction you're probably going to get is disbelief that they even asked you that question. And then when you ask it again, it's probably going to move towards a more anger tone, or, who the heck are you? Why are you bothering me? And all you've done is ask somebody to move their seat. You haven't given them any explanation as to why, right? It's not compounded by the fact that you have power over them as their boss, and the change that you may be implementing may impact their reporting, who their peers are, who their boss is, their job title, their roles and responsibilities of their job, processes that they used to do, now new ones that you want them to do, how you're going to measure them performance-wise, et cetera. So when you start to think about a simple request of, can you move from one seat to another, and you bring that into the context of the business world, the association world, and asking your staff or team or other stakeholders to make change, you're going to elicit a variety of different responses. And the idea, and the thing that you'll hear me talk a lot about, is the balance between people and process, right? So just as we'll talk a lot about process today and needing to have a process to guiding through that type of change. But remember, it's always people that you're trying to move through that process. And that is where the challenge that exists. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. There's different types of change out there, right? From small to large, from changes in, a process to organization wide. And there's also different categories. And so when you think of categories, you can look at these types of changes here, where you yourself might have to change a way that you are leading, or the example that you're creating out of your leadership. Your team might be going through a type of change where perhaps you're implementing a new system, or department-wide, you're implementing something new, or this is a major organization initiative. So the size adds to the complexity. And so that is something to make sure that you understand more about, or things that we'll cover more throughout the presentation, because the more complex things are, right, the more attention has to be given to certain levels of detail. And, I think in today's leadership, you're faced with a significant amount of challenges, but just as many opportunities. We're seeing the level of disruption that's happening right now in the market, kind of resemble the wild, wild west, where there's a lot of opportunities to be had, but the disruption and chaos is fairly significant. So you're by far faced with more complexity and challenge than anyone that came before you. And so what I thought I'd do is I just take a look at some of those challenges that we see happening out there in the market right now for associations. And the first one is how fast technology has advanced. And what we see as an opportunity with technology advancing is that it's enabling associations to operate at scale. Nationwide scale, international scale, but it's removing the concept of geographical boundaries. And that's a huge change, not only in mentality and thinking, but in strategy, as well as how you would design and change an organization to maybe meet a larger education strategy initiative, right? Because now you're in the digital world, and being in the digital world has no geographic boundaries. And those technology advancements are bringing disruption on the business model. So the way and manner in which we deliver services and deliver value to members now has different ways of and different options of delivering those services. And we saw that disruption with the push to virtual in COVID. And now what does that look like going forward for hybrids, in-person versus virtual, or other ways in which we can deliver certain services, programs, and things like that we have. I think with the consolidation of technology and the business models evolving, we're also seeing a huge rise in mergers and affiliations within every nonprofit sector, including associations. And then the big one these days, if anyone saw the news this morning, Amazon just announced that they'll be hiring 150,000 employees during the holiday season, which makes it very difficult to find talent these days. And so one of the major issues, obviously, being workforce crisis and having to address that. But not only that, the rising costs of employees, or as part of your change process, finding those new talents and new skills that you may need to bring into the organization. We're also seeing a lot of regulation and funding shifts, regulation changes and funding shifts. This either has the potential to threaten certain revenue streams or create an opportunity for new revenue models, new revenue streams. And then another big one is the competition that's coming from multiple fronts. And what we mean by this is that if we took education, for example, that education is becoming a commodity, and we're starting to see major players like Microsoft, who owns LinkedIn, who has LinkedIn Learning, get into the market of delivering education. You start to see edX and Khan Academy and Udemy and all these other online platforms. They're starting to compete in the education space. And then what the associations have as tools to compete in that market is content. So if you think about the dynamic that's happening right now between Netflix, Amazon Prime, and other streaming providers, really it's a battle for content. And the associations are entering that space right now, where they'll be in possession of very strategic and valuable content pertaining to the industries that they serve, and developing strategy around that is a major change initiative. And the reality of change is that it starts with you, it starts with the leadership. There's many projects that we've seen where, we had to work with leadership on understanding the level of change, getting them to embrace it so that they were psychologically prepared, as well as had a high degree of ownership to drive it forward, right? If you think of something as simple as maybe launching an LMS platform or adopting a new CRM technology solution, if that's something you're not, as the leader, embracing and modeling and in working with your team on, then the standard is not set to where that change might be completed through the team, department, and the organization. Those things are actually smaller than the initial psychology of the leader. And one thing that we hear a lot about on our projects is the need for accountability, right? And so, many factors can go into instilling and building accountability. And the first one is worth mentioning, again, as we've already covered, is leading by example. So whatever desired level of change, whether it be really small or huge, is led by the senior team, is led by the highest levels of leadership, and owned at that level, so that example, expectation, and standard is set throughout the organization. As you move on this journey of implementing or changing or doing something different in a different way, identifying where that's owned and who owns some of those roles and responsibilities is important. Role clarity and understanding how my position as an employee might be changing, and then how I am measured on my performance, is very important to clarify, because production is the basis of morale. So if I can clarify how my teammates are able to produce, then they can see how they clearly win at the game, and thus be more satisfied in their role, having that understanding. And that helps to build ownership as you move forward and you see employees and team members adopting new ways of doing things. One of the challenging parts of change and holding people accountable is the need for having a clear action for non-performers. And so typically, as you move through some sort of process or plan, you may have folks that are not able or willing to keep up, or are kind of the laggards within the organization. And there needs to be a clear path to either address that performance issue or support them in realizing that they need to move on from the organization. Because if it is a large scale change and you're changing the dynamic in the way your business model functions and operates and things to that extent, you need the team capable to be able to drive that through. And part of the way of driving that level of change is ensuring that you have a clear plan that designates between the process that you're going to go through and the types of groups and individuals that you're going to manage to and through that. If you think of large scale change, it has to be about engaging people. It's nothing that should be done, by yourself. This is where you involve, large groups, large teams, large task force, if it's sizable. If it's really small, it might be a few members of your team. What drives the success is allocating the time to work on the organization versus in it. As you prioritize the time, one, that sends a message throughout the organization that this is a high priority. It's something that we're going to meet about on an ongoing basis. And it pulls us away from working in our roles to be able to talk about the change, which gives us more objectivity and allows us to communicate more effectively. Working on the organization also helps you manage the pace of change, right? Because going slow is just as dangerous as going too fast. And so we always talk about the concept of going slow to go fast and building those small wins so that will create momentum in whatever it is that you're doing. And so when we consider as a consulting firm what change is, we look at it as moving from strategic planning or having some sort of desired plan or outcome into organization design or implementation. And those we kind of use synonymous with each other. And part of looking at some of the areas that need attention as a result of change, these are the categories that we look at, right? And this is called the STAR model by Jay Galbraith. And it really starts with understanding the capabilities, right? If we're coming out of strategic planning, that new area of focus or that new thing that we're going to be doing may require additional capabilities that we don't have. And that those capabilities could be things like a highly competitive education delivery concept and model, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be people. And so you start to think about what those gaps are within those capabilities, and that gives you a starting point and a framework to reference some of these other things as well. One of the big pieces is structure. And you may have heard structure follows strategy and that saying, but really what we've seen is organizations that have gone through tremendous growth or tremendous disruption. If they've gone through tremendous growth, then we have found that they may have been victims of their own success and broken their infrastructure or outgrown their infrastructure. And that's an opportune time to reevaluate, because if they keep adding growth on top of something that is no longer able to support it, it will eventually collapse. And so taking that time to really look at the infrastructure and say, how are we structured? What do we need to be able to do to absorb the next level of growth? Or if it's because of disruption, whether that be COVID or other competitive forces or factors, being able to look at the organization and start to get really niche in what you do and identify who is able to do that. And that's the restructuring process. When we look at the component of decision-making or moving and growing up different levels of the organization, leadership needs to have confidence in their team that they're able to make decisions at a new higher level or with added responsibility. And so part of that comes in designing the process that they're expected to go through, or something that may be changing for a process that you do internally. Maybe it's the way and manner in which you enroll new potential members because you're adopting a new technology platform, and then you want to guide them into an LMS, and you're mapping that member journey out. Well, that might be redesigning that process, which leads into a significant amount of change depending upon how big it is. Systems are a big way that we manage our own behaviors. Right? If you think of trying to change people's behaviors, it's really difficult. But if you change the systems that govern those behaviors, it becomes easier for them to abide by because it's managed through a technology solution. And then lastly is the talent piece, is identifying who you have, who you need, and then if there's any need to restructure with key roles that may exist currently. And so these are the 5 categories that we see a lot of change revolving around. And what I'd like to do is walk you through the process to change. And we use John Kotter's 8 steps to change. And what I'm going to do is as we go through each of these steps is talk through an example with a client that we worked with and how we handled certain things throughout the juncture. And then we'll wrap up and be able to answer any questions that you may have. So John Carter's 8 Steps to Change has been really successful for us in terms of undertaking larger scale initiatives. So when we say larger scale, we think of organization-wide. And we had the opportunity to work with a client that had 7 different geographical locations that was managed and was managed by a central office. And that central office had centralized services such as HR, finance, marketing, and IT. And then these 7 locations were structured differently, organized differently. The executive directors and the team members that worked in those different locations interpreted their roles and their jobs in 7 different ways. So there was a lot of fragmentation and there was a lot of inconsistency. And again, they were very lucky because they grew really fast. And as they grew, they started to realize that they were straining the organization and moving from a mom and pop mentality into the need of having a more professionalized infrastructure to be able to grow and scale. The real reason for the project that we did with them was in relationship to their member retention. They were bleeding members out of the organization at a significant attrition rate that was causing concerns regarding the viability of the organization. And this really kind of leads us into step 1, which is when leadership has a clear understanding of the urgency and the need to drive change, right? So step 1 is create a sense of urgency, and to look at this a different way, to ask the question, what's at stake if nothing changes, right? If we fail in our implementation, if we fail in whatever change we're trying to do, what's at stake if nothing changes? And this creates that burning platform to at least stand up out of the chair and get ready to move in a particular direction. So when we were working with our client, we sat down with the CEO and we asked them, what outcomes you would like to see from this change initiative. They wanted to dramatically increase member retention. As many folks that were coming in the door as new members, they had just as many, if not more, leaving out the back door. So there was a clear need about the viability of the organization. Now, the challenge that existed was being able to communicate these brutal truths throughout these 7 locations, to let them know that the value that the organization was delivering was no longer meeting the member needs. And that was demonstrated by the retention metrics. So what we did was we started by putting together and building a guiding coalition. And this is step 2 as part of the process. Now, it's important to not try to undertake change yourself or drive anything large or small, because the more you have your top performers, your big influencers involved in the conversation, the more likely it is to build momentum and gain traction. Plus, you'll get different levels of perspective. So one thing we recommend is, as you go through and you're building a team, is that you're bringing in the top performers. You're bringing in those champions of change. Because if you focus on the low-end performers or the laggards, just to try to get them involved and inspired in the process, it's giving them too much of the attention, when we really want our top performers and champions of change to be driving these initiatives. We want to focus on the bright spots of the organization. And so to kind of give the example of what we were working on with our client, we formed a coalition of 14 different people. We had 2 individuals from each job function area, or 2 major job function areas. So we had representation throughout all levels of the organization and all levels of perspective. And this was really important because when we were either building the plan or implementing the plan, we were able to get those perspectives as to what would work and what wouldn't work. But as we started to implement and execute, they became strong advocates in the communications process and became an essential cog in that solution. And so these folks were really able to guide the work, drive the work, and provide the feedback around it that influenced the rest of the the rest of the organization. So it wasn't just about the ivory tower, right? It's not just about the C-suite and the senior leadership team. It was really about those diverse opinions and those diverse viewpoints around those champions that would help guide this work. Once we got the team together, obviously some of these things will seem pretty intuitive, is putting together a vision and the initiatives that you want to undergo with regards to the change. And so when we look at the vision or the initiatives, some of this might come from your strategic plan if you have one, and that's if that's the document that's driving the change, that's great, because that gives a lot of context for what you need to go after and start doing. But this is actually building the change process. This is about how are we going to move from point A to point B at the detailed level, and who are we going to move to and through that. As you build process, I would recommend having a people component to that. Who needs to be involved? How are we going to move them to and through that? Because the more stakeholders you can get engaged and have clarity on their participation, the more you can build ownership and buy-in into that process. So when we worked on the vision and the initiatives with our clients, we had talked about in step 3, restructuring the entire organization. We talked about having the need for 3 new positions of strategic value, where we had to pink slip a lot of folks and then rehire back some of the key performers. We talked about bringing in centralized systems, right, that would be able to be housed at that higher, we'll call it parent corporation level, that served those 7 locations. So we had large plans for major change over an 18-month period. What we needed to do was we needed to engage the full team, which is step 4. So as that small task force, that coalition gets together and they're helping organize, plan, and drive the work, we needed to be able to communicate that throughout the entire organization to eliminate fragmentation. So whether the organization had 12 people in one location or 200 people in one location, becoming that broken record around communication helps them understand that whatever is about to be initiated has been well thought through, is communicated, and expectation is being set throughout the organization, because the last thing you want is fragmentation. And this will help build ownership and buy-in through all levels, but also identify or help to identify those people that don't want to participate and come along for that ride. So as we built this communications plan at this step, we were able to roll that out in bite-sized pieces according to what phase of the plan was going to be happening next. And again, the communications plan, nothing's really happened. We've put the plan in place. We've got a communications plan that we've rolled out. It's always when you tend to hit the go button and start implementing and start executing that everybody says, stop, time out, I'm not ready. And this is when leadership experiences the most challenge, is because up until this point here, it's been planning and the change is not real yet. But as you start implementing, the change becomes real. And the first thing that you will experience is barriers and obstacles. And those can come in, again, 2 different forms. They can come in policy, process, and systems, or they can come in people. And so when you start to think about the new initiatives that you want to undertake, what processes or what policies do you have that are contrary to the change you're trying to make or disruptive to that? And those will start to materialize. And that's when leadership can step up and address those and tackle those issues. When it becomes a people issue, then you have to gauge to what extent are they willing, not willing to participate, and then tackle that. So in the example of our client, we had 2 executive directors at 2 of those 7 locations. And they had become very disruptive to the change and negative advocates of the change. And they were pulled into the CEO and chief operating officer. And one was able to be kind of coached up through a deeper understanding of the initiative, and one had to be coached out of the organization. But what that demonstrated to everybody was that leadership was serious about the change, that they were going to remove the obstacles and barriers, whether they were policy, people, or process, and that they know that this was important to the viability of their organization in this case. So as we started to kind of break through those initial barriers, we got to step 6, which is generate short-term wins. Now, most people need to see something before they believe it. And so getting that belief going early is really important. And the way we do that is we identify the low-hanging fruit or the short-term wins that we can create within weeks or 1 to 2 months at the very most, having started the project. So once that's communicated as that implementation is starting, making sure that you've got those things to be able to promote. And in the case of our client, as we started implementing, one of those executive directors at one of those locations really embraced the change. They embraced the restructure, the role clarity, and the new staff that were being hired, and were able to really be a catalyst in implementing faster than their peers were. And because they implemented faster, they saw small upticks in their member retention rate within about a month and a half. And so that's a success and a huge win that we broadcasted throughout the organization as demonstrating a short-term win. We recognized, we rewarded that behavior, and publicly promoted that, because that helped us create the momentum that we needed. And there's a great quote by Jordan Peterson: incremental improvement repeated over time is virtually unstoppable. And I think that's that's about keeping on pushing and driving the change. And if you remember back, it's about working on the organization. And as you allocate time to work on the organization, you can sustain the change, because you're demonstrating by continuing to meet around the implementation, the change that you're undergoing, that it's a priority and that it's high value for you as a leader. And so you maintain that change acceleration by just having focus on it. And so with my client that we were working with, they had that committee of 14 individuals. They met every other week. And they went right through that full 18-month project. In fact, they wound up continuing to meet after that, but they were able to sustain that work. And because they sustained it with the CEO and the COO's involvement, it was always of the highest priority to complete. And just that attention alone allowed them to sustain the acceleration of this. And eventually it passed that tipping point where it just took off, because we had so many short-term wins and so many successes, and we could start to see the needles move in multiple different areas. And then lastly, as that change accelerates, it's really about recognizing and rewarding those that are making this part of their way of being, right? So the behaviors are starting to change. It's starting to get anchored in the culture of the organization. So whether that's the adoption of a new technology and the continued use of that by someone that you want to recognize, right? Or it's some other major success that was won, or behavior that was changed. It's rewarding those behaviors. And so as a result, with our client that we worked on in undertaking this massive 18-month organization design initiative, which was major change throughout the organization, member retention increased 14% in 18 months, which was a significant success, all because they were able to bring higher levels of order and organization to their infrastructure and the way and manner in which they delivered value. And that was recreated because of the needs and that they identified in the strategic plan. So, as we see these days, technology is disrupting every industry out there, and change is really about evolution and embracing what that may or could be for your organization. And I think the one thing that I'll leave you with before questions, because I wanted to take some time for questions, is that there needs to be a balance in everything between looking at the process and looking at the people involved in that process. And I think that's one of the major reasons that success when you're dealing with any level of change happens, is that it's really easy to spend 20 minutes, an hour writing down a process, but moving people to and through that is the leadership challenge. And so I'll stop here and make sure we have ample time for your questions.
Thanks so much, Eric. And we can just wait on some questions. Just looking at your presentation and seeing all the things that you've covered, I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, sure.
It seems like you've you've really kind of teased out the different things that can impede that change process. I think, the last 2 years, 18 months, however you want to say, what we've all been dealing with has been a lot of change. So have you seen organizations become a little bit more nimble in how they're addressing change right now in their organizations? Because I know that that's a huge factor, is getting your team on board, making sure they buy in, but it seems like everybody is in this place of limbo right now. So have you seen that affect how the process works?
Yeah, I think it starts with building an understanding of some of the macro trends, right? Let's take, for example, remote workforce. What's the likelihood that we're going to go back to 100% remote work, 100% in-person workforce? It's a challenging debate because people have had a year and a half, of conditioning of working without commute, working from home, leveraging technology solutions, which may have created actually more capacity, right? We have folks that we know that are getting out of their leases or downsizing their facilities because they realize that we can manage our workforce remote. Technology has enabled that to be managed at scale or organize that complexity. We've adopted those cloud-based systems so that we can share things across the board. And we're going to stay in a hybrid mode and reduce our costs and try to increase our margins. So I think with that shift in mindset, or margins being increased because we budgeted for the costs of convention centers, but didn't utilize that. And so maybe there's this window of, a larger surplus that an organization might have, or the future potential surplus that an organization might have to redeploy that. Getting ahead of that strategy to determine where are you going to spend that money to remain more viable in the future is critical, because associations are entering this space where they're competing in education fiercely, and they're going to start competing with a lot of other associations outside of their industry. They're going to start competing with higher ed and a lot of these for-profit providers. And that's just because they've moved to digital. Now, when you think about digital, let's just talk about that landscape, right, of change. I move into the digital environment, and do I have the capabilities on my team to promote in that noisy, busy marketing environment? Do I understand somebody that has those capabilities to have our content, our work stand out, right? And so now you start to think about that, and it's a different world, right? Maybe the association is regional, right? And every state has an association with your industry, or you've got kind of regions throughout the country. Now I'm competing with my peers. I've got no boundaries to that. And guess what? They're having those same conversations about competing with you. Before it was a handshake and says, I won't come into your turf. And now it's there is no turf.
Right.
Right. And so those things are when we talk about the psychological change of leaders, is the most important thing, because all the other stuff, can't materialize or come to fruition until leaders embrace that psychological change, that I'm in a different world. And the likelihood of it going back exactly the way it was is probably zero. And so if it's zero, then I have to figure out what the balancing act is and how I can deliver value, whether that's hybrid or testing different solutions to see what gets my biggest return, my biggest participation.
Nice. Eric, there are a few other questions coming in right now. I'm going to go ahead and just start with the ones that we've gotten from the beginning. What are some strategies or suggestions you have for when a majority that wants to change, but you have individuals who are resistant? What are some ways to get those people on board or create some buy-in?
Yeah. So the reality is, when you're driving major change initiatives, either people are going to leave on their own because they'll realize it's no longer the place for them, or you'll realize that they're not able to make the change, or you can coach them into understanding at a deeper level where they get on board. So as you dive into these different initiatives, you have to be really clear as a leader to understand that person's capability. And do they have the capability for the newness that you may be adding to their plate? Because you may have to go out and you have to develop your board, as a CEO, develop your board, acquire the resources, continue to manage the strategic plan, et cetera. You can't be dropping into an organization to do people's jobs for them. Right. And so it's being honest and taking a step back and saying, do we have the capabilities to drive this in specific areas? And if you don't, that's the painful part of change. That's the part that nobody likes to address, but it's making sure that you did everything that you could to build that person up and give them the opportunity for success, and then let that play out.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being very honest about that, Eric. And what do you think the biggest mistake of a chief staff officer or CEO can be when it comes time to make a change?
When it comes time to make a change. So I look at it this way. It is the job of your employees. It is their sole purpose to lower your bar, right? Because the reason that you're in the CEO seat or the chief of staff seat is because that you've earned that and have graduated to those different levels of perspective. And so your strategic purview should be higher, and your strategic understanding, and maybe seeing things that are about your sustainability and viability that others don't. It's others' roles to lower that bar, right? Meaning water seeks its own level. And I'm not saying it in a negative way, but that's what they're going to do, is they're going to challenge you every step of the way. Is this the right thing? Well, this is the way we used to do things and it's working. Why are we changing it? Right? And you're going to experience those obstacles, and you have to work with them or to and through them on overcoming those or addressing those. And again, people is always the stickiest part. But if you're certain about the change that's needed, whether you need it, maybe you need a new LMS platform because the one you have is legacy, outdated, and the user experience on the staffing and the member side is terrible, right? And it's non-competitive. So you have to make a huge change, but your director of education doesn't want to do that because they know that platform and they don't know the other one, right? But you make the call. And so you have to deal with that transition of moving them from one state of managing one system to another, which can be a heavy lift. Right. And they may leave during that process and leave you holding the bag. Right. And then you have to figure out a way to backfill that. But if you know that's what the long-term strategy and needs are for the organization to be competitive and viable in the market, then you know it's over the long run, it's a short blip on the radar screen. Right. It's a short thing or challenge to overcome. And I say short, it might be 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, but it's a necessity to get to where you need to. And that comes down to kind of that difficult decision-making process.
Thanks. You've talked a lot about the change kind of happening or being kind of propelled by leadership. We get this question a lot, just as association professionals, but a lot of our organizations, are smaller, they have less than, 10 staff members. Those are really the folks that tap on us. And how are there suggestions that you can make if you're either in middle management or a director and you want to kind of push for that change, and really, maybe your CEO is not that they're not on board, but they're just not, they just haven't bought into that. Is there a way to drive change from the center?
So you mean managing up?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think it's just about education and awareness. And I would say the same thing, throughout if it's a small organization, let's say I had a staff of 6, right? And I had a director of XYZ and I wanted them to elevate their perspective. I might connect them with their peers at other associations, maybe non-competitive ones, right? That are doing things at a higher level that I would like to see as a leader. And I would try to create those relationships to build awareness so that those ideas come from outside the organization as a development opportunity. Now that takes a while. So you have to understand, like, is the change urgent enough where you need to be pulling the trigger on it pretty quick, or can you build somebody up over 3 to 5 years by creating external relationships for them? I think when you look at the staff to the CEO or the CEO to the board and managing up, I think you have to look at the way you manner in which you communicate. So you need to plant seeds along the way, and those seeds need to be growing, right? So if I'm a CEO and I'm talking to my board and I know we're going to undertake some massive change, I'm not dropping the whole plan on them in one day and then running away, right? I'm gonna mention it one board meeting, and then it was just a mention of it. And the next board meeting, I might expand on what I mentioned and talk a little bit about that urgency that's needed around this change. And then 3 or 4 meetings down the road, I might have a complete plan, which I've had day one. Right. And the same thing with you trying to manage the expectations of your CEO is that, I need this to be successful. And I think the market's heading in this way, and start to plant those seeds, and you build upon them and attach them to some sort of urgency or some sort of pain point. Right. So what the pain point could be is like, hey, we could do more in this area, or we would experience less attrition. Whatever that data point may be, is try to narrow it down to speak in their language. And that language could be in 3 different languages, right? The head, the heart, the wallet. Right. And so my head is the way I think logically. So if you have a very logic-oriented chief operating officer, CEO, or things like that, you talk about process improvement and the structure of the organization. If you've got somebody that is more heart oriented, you'd be talking about the mission, the value to the member, and things like that. If they were more financially oriented, or again, a combination of the both, you'd be talking about more numbers based information. So it's also knowing your stakeholder and how to communicate based off what they value.
Awesome, wonderful, perfect way into our next question, actually, because a lot of people these last 2 years have probably made some drastic changes. I think, we've heard from organizations who have been able to kind of slaughter some sacred cows and move forward with some different initiatives, just because their organization was just, of course, at a place where, change was just happening very rapidly.
Yeah.
So if an organization or if a board sees that, okay, we're done with this pandemic year, we can go kind of backwards into where we were before, and the organization doesn't feel like that's a good course, how do you kind of maneuver through those challenges?
So what you're saying is that there's stakeholders that want to go back to the way it was versus yeah. So I think you're kind of paddling against the current in that everything is getting pushed into this digital space, right, as an association. And I think it's really understanding what's your value proposition. Part of the challenge that exists in strategic planning is thinking, not planning, but thinking in windows of 1 year and 3 year, right? When really what you need to do is stretch your thinking out as to, what does an association successfully operating in our industry look like in 10 years? Like start to conceptualize that vague, abstract landscape, as difficult as it may be, because 10 years is obviously a huge timeline. But you can back into a 3-year plan, but it should be attached to those major changes that are coming over those 10 years, right? Because that will show you the bigger trends versus keep your thinking more at a tactical micro level. Because if you're not riding those trends or understanding them, you're pushing against the market. And that's when the competitive forces are going to come in and really be disruptive. Because here's the thing, let's say there's 51 organizations, right? 51 associations. Every state has an association, and then they have a national association. They will all compete with each other on education. And so that's why we're seeing the consolidation and the mergers and affiliations, is to pool resources, right? If I have a $2 million budget and my 2 neighbors have $2 million budgets, and we can pool our resources and combine our education teams, now I've got more margin to cover more investment in becoming more viable or competitive in the market, because national is probably doing that as well. And so you'll start to see these things conflict with each other, unfortunately. But that is what is being driven out of this kind of these collapsing walls. And so I think as you elevate your timelines, you're able to see things and those trends more clearly, to realize like maybe we shouldn't go back to the way things were, and our strategy shouldn't be based on a backwards point of view. We should be looking forward and trying to figure out what those trends look like. And that's an easy conversation to have with your board or your senior leadership team. If you push the time horizons out to 10 years, one, they're not threatening because, you know, your board members probably won't be there. Two, you know, it's big and macro, and you'll talk about things that are probably going to materialize in the next 3 to 5 years.
Nice. Thank you so much, Eric. Question that we've got that came in: any suggestions on how to politely push back on bad change, or even challenge potential change, whether it's good or bad, without seeming like the problem child around the table?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So let's say the CEO is resolved in what they're looking at, and you disagree. I think the first thing, if you're a direct report of that person, is to get on their playing field and understand where they're coming from. And if it's they want to go back to the way things were, it's maybe start to build that messaging in around, you know, future trends and what things look like, or maybe kind of just, you know, hey, can I work with you on a planning session? I want to talk to you about a couple things, and start building things, you know, building that awareness towards what you're seeing, so that you can reconcile those 2 points of view. And then maybe there's key points that you can, you know, single out that they're talking about as part of their strategy that, you know, you realize are not viable or are not going to work. And as you enroll them in your process and your thinking and understanding, and you've acknowledged that you see theirs, they might be more receptive, but that's a very difficult task.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you've actually addressed most of the questions that have come in. I feel like a lot of your answers, it took me back to actually my research and argumentation class, and really just that art of convincing somebody and persuading somebody and making them see just exactly what you talked about. The points, hit them where you know it's going to impact them.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges, no, I appreciate that. One of the challenges, I'll just leave you with it, is that when you look at associations, you know, a lot of leadership may have worked with their coworkers for a very long period of time, right? And so when you start to realize that there's certain change that needs to be made throughout the organization, there's entrenched relationships, which makes it even harder to be able to make those decisions or make those changes. Whether it's, you know, any change is kind of a perceived loss, right? If I'm an employee and I have 5 things on my plate, but you take one of those away so that I can get more hyper focused and successful on those 4 things, I still perceive it as a loss, right? And so it's being able to kind of manage and coordinate some of those things that are moving around, or people that are moving around to different spots. And it gets harder to do the longer that relationship has existed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I appreciate your time today, Eric, and I'm sure our members appreciate it also. We've got your information up. We can also, if you want, make your PowerPoint available to folks if they want
Absolutely.
to. And then we've also got the recording of the session. So thank
you
so
if anyone
much.
wants a copy of the deck, they can just shoot it to my email, which is up on the screen, eric@curtisstrategy.com, and I can email that over to them, and I'll put that in the chat as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eric. I appreciate your time today, and we'll hopefully see you soon.
All right. Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye, y'all.